Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Shamari Gilliard, Senior Vice President and Director of Wealth Planning at Klingenstein Fields Advisors. I'd like to welcome you today to our discussion on navigating the complex world of advanced healthcare directives. Joining us today is a very special guest, Dr. Mark Lax, who is an expert in the field of aging and geriatrics and palliative medicine. You may remember Dr. Lax from a previous event we held in 2018, where he spoke so eloquently on the related issues of navigating healthcare as we and our loved ones grow older. As always, we hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and finding ways to get outside and enjoy some springtime weather. Here in the New Jersey, New York area, it's getting warmer, and my family and I are definitely spending time outside together, and I hope you're doing the same. Our topic today is particularly relevant in light of the pandemic. Many individuals and families were faced with extremely difficult and unanticipated healthcare situations due to COVID-19. This was complicated by the fact that it was typically not possible to be with loved ones in person or at times even communicate remotely. While it's not a situation that any of us likes to dwell on, advanced healthcare planning can make a very difficult time a little easier for family members or others who must help determine what is the best course of action in a medical emergency. It is especially timely this month since April 16th is National Healthcare Decisions Day. There are a number of different legal directives which are designed to help deal with potential scenarios. And it can be confusing to understand how each directive works and its purpose. In Dr. Lax's field, he provides guidance to help individuals navigate the healthcare system, which often involves advocating for oneself and determining what one's wishes are in emergency situations. He's here today to help us understand and decipher the world of advanced healthcare directives. Dr. Lax is the Irene and Roy Satie Distinguished Professor of Medicine at the Weill Cornell Medical College. He is co-chief of geriatric and palliative medicine and the director of geriatrics for the New York Presbyterian Healthcare System, as well as co-founder and chief gerontological officer of Compass Care, a highly regarded concierge home care company serving Manhattan, Westchester, and Nassau County in New York, and Fairfield County in Connecticut. He is the recipient of numerous honors, including a National Institute of Aging Academic Leadership Award, an American College of Physician Teaching and Research Scholarship, and the Carter Burden Humanitarian Award in Aging. He has testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Aging, was a delegate to the White House Conference on Aging in 2006, and has served as a consultant to the World Health Organization. His particular area of focus is the disenfranchised elderly, on which he has published widely, including his book, Treat Me, Not My Age. During this call, you can submit questions in one of two ways. If you are listening through your computer, there is a widget on the right where you can submit questions. You can also email them to mildred.palo@klingenstein.com. Again, that's MILDRED.PALO@klingenstein.com. And now, without further ado, we welcome Dr. Lax.
Well, thank you very, very much, and it's an honor to be here. I'm sorry you can't see me. We're having a little technical difficulties with the camera, but you can see my slides hopefully. And I'm not that good looking, although I did put on a tie today for the first time in about a year. So it's wonderful to be here on what feels like an optimistic day. And my topic is in an odd way optimistic because it allows you to take control of something that many people regard as frightening. But it really, I tell patients and families, affords you enormous control, and you lose control if we don't sort of think about these things. So So this is a topic that's easy to avoid, and here's why you shouldn't. It turns out that in modern times, a sizable proportion of deaths are preceded by what we call decisional incapacity. You know, back in the day, you know, you could be skewered as a hunter-gatherer by a wild boar, or fall off a wagon in the Wild West. But because healthcare has improved, often there are periods where people are debilitated in the course of an illness, and that debility might include incapacity. So it's important that you let people know what your wishes are should you lose decisional capacity. Furthermore, the default setting in the United States is, if you haven't stated your preferences, do everything, the full court press. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but unlike many other countries in Europe and elsewhere, if you get into a medical emergency and you don't state your specific wishes, if you wish not to be resuscitated or have heroic measures, you will nonetheless likely get them. Furthermore, even if you put everything in writing, it's not like in the movies. Things don't play out in a very nice way, and I'll show you some entertaining clips to explain how that is. And again, I emphasize, if you don't express your wishes, you lose control. What do people fear as they age? I just had a big birthday. They fear losing control, and this is an opportunity, really, I think, to remain in control. So let's start with a dictionary definition, advanced directives. This is from Oxford. A written statement of a person's wishes regarding medical treatment, often including a living will, we'll talk about that, made to ensure that those wishes are carried out should the person be unable to communicate them to a doctor. Seems straightforward, but it's really kind of confusing, because if you think about it, what wishes? You know, wishes for life-sustaining treatment, a ventilator, a feeding tube, lesser things, antibiotics if I have, say, advanced Alzheimer's disease and I want to pass quietly, and under what circumstances. You know, if I get hit by a car crossing Park Avenue and briefly need a ventilator to have my lungs heal, you know, I think I, as a 25-year-old, want to have those interventions, as opposed to if I had a end-stage Lou Gehrig's disease, you know, and so you can understand that context is critical here. First of all, second of all, you know, who determines if I can't make decisions, right? That can be very much in the eye of the beholder, right? And who determines who makes decisions for me? That's the healthcare proxy. And what about if that person's on an airplane? That's happened to me, or they were designated 50 years ago in the course of doing an estate plan, and now they're deceased, or they themselves have incapacity. So all kinds of twists and turns here that I'll try to walk you through. But under the general term advanced directives, I kind of think of it as an umbrella. You'll see a bunch of terms like healthcare proxy, also known sometimes as a durable of a power of attorney for healthcare. Living will, a term you'll see. A do not resuscitate order, or DNR. And I think the most recent joiner to this list is something called the MOLST, M-O-L-S-T, stands for Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. In New York and Connecticut and throughout the country, you're seeing this a lot. And I'll talk a little bit about all of these things. So in this talk, I'll explain the rationale for each of these documents and how to complete them and who completes them. I will explain some of the dirty little secrets, you know, some of the pitfalls of each of them and how you can't always avoid them, but you can minimize the risk of getting into difficulty and confusion, okay? And I'm gonna use, believe it or not, and I do this with Cornell medical students, episodes of Seinfeld to introduce the topic, to lighten it up a little bit. I used to give this talk with, you know, papers and handouts, and I put generations of medical students to sleep. And then in the mid-90s, I began to use episodes of the syndicated popular TV show Seinfeld to kind of make my points, and it became a very popular lecture. And so you'll get, I'm going to save you a ton of tuition. I'm going to give you a partially free medical school tuition, and literally this is some of the stuff I do with the medical students. So the episode of Seinfeld that I use to teach this topic and to make something very serious a little lighter is called The Comeback. And if those of you who have seen Seinfeld, if you haven't, where you been? And you need not be a Seinfeld fan to enjoy this lecture, I don't think. You know, Seinfeld typically revolves around a single idea, soup or or relationships, and there are several subplots all converging on an idea. And so this episode, The Comeback, is allegedly about George. George is insulted at a business meeting and sort of embarrassed by a colleague, and he spends most of the episode searching in vain for a witty retort to this coworker's insult early in the episode. But for a geriatrician, there's another comeback here, which is really much more interesting and really highlights what we're going to talk about today. Kramer rents a direct-to-video terrible movie called The Other Side of Darkness, in which a woman falls into an irreversible coma. Of course, she ultimately recovers, and this causes all kinds of consternation, highlighting some of the points that I'm going to make today. And so he decides he needs an advanced directive. He needs to state his wishes, and he decides that he needs a healthcare proxy, and he after some consternation and deliberating, he makes Elaine his healthcare proxy, and he goes to a lawyer. That lawyer is played by the former Nixon speechwriter Ben Stein. And in this clip I'm about to show you, he declares his preferences with Elaine to the lawyer.
Situation number 4, breathing on your own, you're conscious, but with no muscular function.
I don't like the sound of this one.
Yeah, let's pull the cord.
Yank it like you're starting a mower.
Moving on. You have liver, kidneys, and gallbladder, but no central nervous system.
Well, I gotta have a central nervous system.
All right, you can eat. The machines do everything else.
I'd stick.
Yeah, stick. Because I could still go to the coffee shop.
That's it.
So, it seems silly and funny, but I got to tell you, when I trained in the 80s, there were 50-page documents in which dozens of permutations were laid out for patients and families. What would you want in this situation, that situation? Would you want dialysis? I mean, to lay people, and people found it absolutely overwhelming, and in many cases, not a helpful way to relieve the anxiety. I mean, you are hearing about all these horrible things that doctors could do to you while you're trying to sort of, in a quiet moment, make some decisions. And there's been a movement more towards the selection of a healthcare proxy, Elaine in that vignette, who really sort of understands your preferences generally, perhaps guided by a companion document called a living will. Again, we'll talk about that. But I think in the past year, people are talking more and more about end of life and advanced directives. I think we have an aging society. Aging is on everybody's mind. I don't care how old you are. Aging begins in utero, by the way. You've heard me say that before. I mean, COVID has laid bare the limitations of medicine. We overpromise in my field. We have wonderful advertisements for the amazing things we do. And we do amazing things, but medicine has limitations. And in the fall, and particularly in the spring, I cared for some very ill people and threw every possible treatment at them. Nothing worked. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And I learned that people have really strong preferences about all kinds of healthcare, whether they express them or not. I saw someone, very interesting aside, I saw someone yesterday in the office who wanted to have their hip replaced. And, usually that's because they want to play golf or tennis. And I went through this whole list of questions you're supposed to ask. And I know that doesn't matter to me. That doesn't matter to me. You want to lift your grandchildren? I have no grandchildren. And finally, I couldn't figure out, why this person wanted their hip replaced. And finally, I asked that question, and this person said to me, because I cannot have sexual intercourse without pain. I had not even thought of that. I mean, that's what a great reason to have a joint replacement, right? But it's not part of the usual things that we think about, right? And so healthcare is incredibly individualized. People have unique, highly personal healthcare outcome preferences, but never so much as when it comes to end-of-life care. And to point this out, I'm going to do a little clip of George here. This is an episode called The Pilot, in which Jerry and George have written a very successful pilot. It's going to be a big hit, and they're going to be rich finally. But there's a monkey wrench. The monkey wrench is George has just come from a dermatologist. There's something on his lip. He thinks it's going to be cancer. And of course, this is going to ruin everything. Of course, it turns out to be nothing. And here in this episode, George expresses his very unusual preferences around end-of-life care.
I told you God would never let me be successful. I never should have written that pilot. Now the show will be a big hit. We'll make millions of dollars, and I'll be dead. Dead, Jerry. Because of this.
Can't you at least die with a little dignity?
No, I can't. I can't die with dignity. I have no dignity. I want to be the one person who doesn't die with dignity. I live my whole life in shame. Why should I die with dignity?
Well, you know, you laugh, but there's some incredible data. This is a paper by a colleague of mine, Marcia Steinhardt in Pittsburgh, that looked at patients and their doctors and, you know, interviewed them separately and asked the doctors, what do you think matters to this patient with regard to end-of-life care? And they asked the patients that, and there was incredible disagreement. So, for example, I'll just you know, a few of these. People were asked, do you think this patient wants to be mentally aware at end of life? And about 65% of patients said, physicians rather, said, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, 2/3 said. 92% of patients said, look, if my pain is controlled and I'm not suffering, I want to be aware. Many people wanted to be at peace with God. Physicians, you know, sort of less so. Patients did not want to be a burden to families. Physicians didn't even think about that. I mean, I've had situations in the last couple of weeks where I just assumed that someone wanted to pass away at home. Because we have this kind of folk belief that everyone preferred to die in their home. And, you know, this spouse said to me, you know, we have grandchildren at home. We think it would be very traumatic. And this was a person who preferred to pass away in a physical hospice. So the point here is that patients, therefore, are told to select a healthcare proxy to make decisions if they cannot, and also create what's often called a companion document, a living will, to help to guide the proxy. But there are a bunch of problems. Even if you do the paperwork correctly, you select someone, you have a living will, there's a bunch of things that your doctor probably doesn't tell you about. Now I'm going to tell you about. The first problem is people avoid this topic altogether because they believe that designating a healthcare proxy is expensive and requires a lawyer. Now, for Kliggenstein clients, I suspect that's not an issue. I suspect that you have an estate plan, and probably at the end of your first estate plan meeting, maybe in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, that had to do with finances and you know, willing of assets. The last 5 or 10 minutes was delegated to a bunch of documents that had to do with healthcare. And you might have been young, you know, at that point when you first met that lawyer before revising those documents. And at that point, you have writer's cramp. I've been through this, and you're just signing stuff, and you say, okay. It turns out that for people of any means, you do not need a lawyer, and you do not. You need some witnesses, and it doesn't require any expense. It can be done in a physician's office. You can download these forms online. I'll show you some sites where you can do that. In this episode, Kramer, after having seen this movie, decides he wants Jerry to be his healthcare proxy, and he has a misconception about what constitutes a legal document.
Jerry, you ever seen the movie The Other Side of Darkness?
No.
It's about this woman in a coma. Well, I couldn't finish watching it, so I want you to read this.
I, Cosmo Kramer, having just seen the movie The Other Side of Darkness, and not wanting to be in a coma like that lady in the movie, hereby want Jerry Seinfeld to remove my life support, feeding machine, lung blower, etc., etc., etc.
Can you do that for me, buddy?
Well, I don't know if what you have here constitutes a legally binding document.
Well, I'm gonna type it up. Oh, hey, new racket, huh?
Yeah, I wasn't going to get it, but this guy Milos, who runs the pro shop, he really recommended it. In fact, it's the only racket he plays with.
Oh, you're not gonna need this anymore.
I'll explain to you why I left the tennis racket in. It comes up in a minute. So it turns out that designating a healthcare proxy is not important and doesn't require, it's important. It's not expensive. It doesn't require a lawyer or anything like that. The other problem with healthcare proxies, and here's one that I need to talk to you all about, is that proxies are sometimes wrong. there have been a bunch of studies in which someone is interviewed separately from the person that they've designated their healthcare proxy. There have been 50 studies now, and it shows that the person that you have designated as your proxy, okay, has no idea what you want, or misconstrues, or has a different idea about what you want, which is why it's incredibly important that you effectively speak with the person to tell them that you've designated them as your proxy. Imagine being called to an ICU in the middle of the night, or someone who has designated you as their proxy and hasn't told you. I mean, the second mistake that is made is that someone is told that they're the proxy, but there's been no discussion about end-of-life preferences, which is equally sort of ghastly in oversight. Here, Kramer has figured out that Jerry is a bad proxy. He doesn't understand his wishes, and he thinks Elaine should be the proxy, and this is how he comes to this conclusion.
This out of the garbage?
Yeah, it's still got some spring in the string.
Jerry, this is a piece of junk. How are you going to be the executor of my living will? You see, you can't let go. Hey, Elaine, do you have some free time tomorrow afternoon?
Me?
Yeah, because you're perfect. You're a calculating, cold-hearted businesswoman. And when there's dirty work to be done, you don't mind stomping on a few throats.
Oh, come on.
I love Elaine's sort of bashfulness there. So you see that in a comical way, I'm trying to make the point that your proxy may not know what you want, and don't assume that, and have a conversation. And then finally, dirty little secret number 3 is that people change their minds. This is a fascinating literature, about people's perception of disability when it really is in their lives versus in the abstract. And I'll give you an example from my own life. I remember as a first-year medical student in the 80s, being at Bellevue and NYU and seeing a patient with oxygen. I was a 22-year-old medical student, and I thought to myself, my goodness, if I had to live with oxygen to go to the supermarket or to the movie theater, I just don't think I'd want to live like that. Well, fast forward about 40 years, and as we get older, it turns out that we think differently about what it would like to be alive. And I've since decided that if I can't run a 4-minute mile, I still would probably like to go on a bit longer. And there's this entire literature on the stability of life care preferences. I'll show you some data in a second. My point here is that once you do this, it's not static. Things change, your views change, your preferences change. You get chronic illnesses, some get better, some get worse. And that's an opportunity to revisit your preferences with your healthcare proxy. And this is exactly what happened to Kramer.
Jerry, listen. I saw the rest of that movie, The Other Side of Darkness. The coma lady wakes up at the end.
Oh, I wanted to see that. Thanks a lot.
I didn't know it was possible to come out of a coma.
I didn't know it was possible not to know that.
How's Eric Roberts as the husband?
Oh, unforgettable. I gotta find Elaine. She's gonna pull my plug.
Again, funny, but meant to illustrate a point, which is people gain knowledge, people's conditions change. Here's data from a paper that came out, it's been a number of years now, but this is the same group of people asked about their preferences around life-sustaining treatment, asked 3 years apart. These were people in their 70s when it started. 3 years before their initial interview, about 20% of people said that they would like less care. About 2/3 states the same, but 10% of people, 11% of people said, no, I've changed my mind now as I've gotten sicker and frailer. There's been new romance in my life. I want to see a grandchild. I want to go to a wedding. I want to be kept alive. And my job is not to talk people into or out of something. My job is to elicit their preferences and honor that. So with that sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek sort of introduction to some of the issues that come up, I want to talk a little bit about advanced directive forms you may see in New York or Connecticut for that matter. It's quite identical for that purpose. And I'll talk a little bit about the healthcare proxy, a little bit about the living will. I'll talk about do not resuscitate orders, and finally a bit about medical orders for life-sustaining treatment, and then maybe we can have a robust discussion after that. So who does this and what's the purpose? Well, very simply, a healthcare proxy form is done by a patient. Don't even need your doctor. You can do this at home, can download the forms. I'll show you one in a moment. The purpose is to assign a healthcare agent in the setting of incapacity, okay? And the incapacity could be permanent, as in the case of a devastating stroke that leaves you unable to speak and think, but it could be transient. It could be a situation in, like I described earlier, in which you were hit by a car and you were comatose for a few weeks, and for that period of time, decisions had to be made not only about your finances. For that, you would have a financial power of attorney, a separate document, but you would have a healthcare proxy. And when you regain capacity, if you regain capacity, the agency would then go to you. But as I've shown you in these little vignettes from Seinfeld, you know, we can list out you know, all the things that we want to do in a living will. A living will is a companion document, but having a healthcare proxy really is quite important for someone to understand your sort of general approach to the world. So let's talk a little bit about designating a healthcare proxy. Again, it's the person who makes decisions when you can't, and you get to pick an alternate. Okay, let's talk about this. So typically in virtually every state I've practiced in and throughout the United States, you pick a healthcare proxy, and if that person's unavailable because of travel, incapacity, or death of that person. By the way, I saw that last week, by the way. I had a patient who, a couple who did their wills in their 40s. Each was each other's healthcare proxy. No children, no alternate designated. And the husband became incapacitated, and the living wills were not updated, and the spouse had Alzheimer's disease. She was incapable of sort of serving as a healthcare proxy because she herself lacked capacity from a different disease. And look, if you fill these out in your 40s, and if you're going to have your spouse as a healthcare proxy, there's an increased chance, as opposed to designating a child, that spouse is going to have incapacity. That's why I will generally suggest as patients get older to designate someone else, someone younger, usually an adult child. Now, look, if you're going to pick a child, you got to choose wisely. And I can't advise you about this. I have 3 kids. They're all different. But it's really quite compelling as to, you know, who you should sort of think about sort of in this role. Your kids may all be on the same page. They may not be on the same page. You know, very often if there's a child who's in healthcare, not necessarily a physician, an administrator or a nurse, that's who's picked because they have familiarity with the system. And then another child is the alternate, but that doesn't preclude you from sort of speaking to all your kids, if that's your style and that's the nature of your relationship with your children and their relationships with each other, because even if you've named one of your kids as the proxy, it's very nice to have all your kids on the same page. In geriatrics, there's a very famous paper called The Daughter from California, and that we like to quote. This is a situation, and I've had this happen to me, where a patient with, say, advanced pancreatic cancer is near the end of life. It's going very well. It's peaceful. We've all decided that hospice care is appropriate. No sort of unseemly interventions. Patient was in agreement. Now has lost capacity, and then all of a sudden, a son or daughter from California arrives with a completely different view as to, you know, why aren't you sending my mom to the intensive care unit? It creates all kinds of disruption and concern and unearthed sibling spats from childhood. So I would urge you to think about that. As I said earlier, the most important thing you can do in creating these documents is to tell the person you've designated that you've designated them, right? Because this is not a surprise you want when you're in an ICU in the middle of the night, but also to talk in great length about your preferences in the light of day, as opposed to in the setting of a crisis. Lastly, I would say about designating a healthcare proxy, if you don't designate one, Uncle Sam does this for you. And it does this through, depending on the state, a series of familial relationships. So If you're married and you haven't designated a proxy, it would typically be your spouse. If you have no spouse, it would then fall to children. It would then fall to a sibling. There's a pecking order of who gets selected as a default if you don't do this, but you lose control if you don't take the opportunity to do this. Here's a New York State healthcare proxy form. It's pretty straightforward. I don't have the signature page, but you need witnesses, not a lawyer, not a doctor, right? And file it away. I tell my patients to give it to me and I put it into their medical record. I scan it in. The living will is simply a document that provides some direction to the healthcare proxy about what your preferences are. That was Ben Stein sort of reading through these ridiculous hypotheticals, not all of which can be anticipated. This can be done also without a lawyer, but lawyers often do this. It can be done, documents available through websites, and it is often regarded as a companion document to assigning a healthcare proxy. Again, the problem is that medicine does not play out as neatly as one would expect towards the end of life, or even in earlier life. I've given you several examples of, if someone hit by a car. I mean, if you're someone who doesn't want heroic measures, but you briefly choke on a chicken bone and have 20 years of life expectancy, please take that bone out of my throat. Don't watch me, suffocate without a Heimlich maneuver or something, right? And then we have let me show you just a typical New York living will. There are dozens of these. It provides a bit more specificity. If you look at the bottom left here, I do not want cardiac resuscitation, mechanical ventilation. I do not want artificial nutrition and hydration. I do not want antibiotics. It goes into some more detail to give some general sort of guidance to the healthcare proxy about what you would want. Again, I keep saying it over and over. You just can't anticipate everything. Notice the signature lines. I don't see any doctor here. I don't see any lawyer here, okay? Again, the goal here has been to remove the barriers to make this easy for people. And yes, April is medical decision-making month, as was pointed out. Do not resuscitate orders are a bit more straightforward. These are orders that indicate that should your heart stop suddenly, or you stop breathing, that you are not resuscitated, that they don't do those things you see on television, that they shock the chest or begin doing chest compressions. This is an order that's typically written by a physician. It typically refers to healthcare facilities. So if you've been in a hospital recently, they've asked you about your DNR preferences. But there is also something known as a home DNR. This is the New York State do not resuscitate home DNR order. And this is meant for the situation in which you're home, perhaps you have advanced cardiac disease or Alzheimer's disease. Something comes up where EMS needs to be called. Maybe you fell out of bed and broke a hip, and that's something that I'd certainly want fixed. But in the event of a serious heart attack that would lead to death shortly or respiratory arrest, you or your family member would not want to be intubated or have mechanical or heroic life-sustaining treatments. These are filled out every 6 months in New York State. It does need to be signed by a physician. As you see, I put my license number, and it's displayed prominently. I tell people to put it by the bedside or on the refrigerator, so that EMS, by the way, is again instructed to do everything. In the absence of a document like this, there's a similar document in the state of Connecticut and in most jurisdictions throughout the United States. And finally, I want to talk about the MOLST, the Medical Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment. And this has gotten a lot of steam, and I do think this is an important document, particularly for people who are developing or who have developed serious illness with a limited life expectancy. And it's meant to address not only resuscitation, but all kinds of preferences at home and in the hospital with a lot more specificity. It is viewed really as a medical order. It contains actionable medical orders that must be signed by a physician. I generally recommend it for use in persons who have advanced chronic progressive illness. And really, though, younger people, anyone interested in further defining their end-of-life wishes, It could be used to either limit medical interventions or to clarify a request for all medically indicated treatments, including resuscitation. So again, I come back to this point that my job here is not to talk people into or out of these treatments. It's really to hear their preferences and be an advocate. This is the MOLS. This is the first page. It's a 4-page document. It's my recollection. Here's a section E of the MOLS, just to give you a sense of the increased specificity here. It talks about comfort measures only, limited medical interventions. It talks about intubation and mechanical ventilation. This is generally what goes on in CPR. Do you want fluids? Do you want to be hospitalized at all? I mean, under any circumstances. I have patients at home and in the nursing home who not only do not resuscitate, they don't want to be hospitalized under any circumstances. Some of them, in fact, don't even want antibiotics. I had a patient last month who was dying of Alzheimer's disease, had a very sort of well-articulated living will. I knew him when he was competent. Family was completely on board. The most common cause of death in patients with Alzheimer's disease is pneumonia. And when he got a pneumonia towards the end of his life, it was his wishes, and the family complied, that he not get even oral antibiotics for this, because they viewed this as a natural cause of death. And I followed and honored their wishes and instead focused on comfort, which is what I do in my palliative care role. People will often ask me, what's the difference between a MOLST and this healthcare proxy and its companion living will document? Well, a MOLST applies right now, right, to someone typically with chronic illness, very serious chronic illness. A living will is completed ahead of time. I did my first living will in my 20s, okay? A MOLST is not necessarily conditional on losing decision-making capacity. A healthcare proxy really springs, as the lawyers would say, goes into effect when you have lost capacity. It is a set of actionable medical orders. It's really viewed like a set of orders. It looks like a medical order. And it's approved by the New York State Department of Health and many others, including Connecticut, for use in different facilities. It's meant to travel with you from place to place to place. And the MOLST, again, accompanies you everywhere. And to my earlier point about Kramer's change in preferences after he learns that you can come out of a coma, the MOLST should be reviewed and renewed periodically, even if nothing's going on. That's required, of course, by state and local legislation, federal legislation. If the individual's preferences change, if the individual health status changes, or if the patient moves to another setting. Anytime one of my patients goes from the hospital to home or the hospital to rehab or back to the hospital, I revisit their advanced directives. I revisit their preferences and their family's understanding of those so that there's no confusion. So those are my formal remarks. Here are a few resources I like. My goodness, there's so many great places to get information, and we can provide you with some. I think we will. You can Google any of these. The Conversation Project. This is a great website about how to talk to a relative about, end-of-life care, which can be difficult. It has great tips like, remember when Uncle Sid was in the ICU and we went there every day for a month? Do you remember what that was like? Would you want that? The American Bar Association has a great toolkit for healthcare advanced planning. My colleague at UCSF has a great website called Prepare for Your Care, which just lays it out in an 8th grade level and is really trying to get healthcare planning to the masses. There's also another great website called Death Over Dinner, in which we bring these conversations out into the open. So I spoke for about 35 minutes, and it's an honor to have addressed you. I am happy to take any questions, and I think I will turn the control of the presentation back to our moderator.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Lax. That was informative and it was entertaining. We appreciate your expert perspective on developing an advanced healthcare plan and an overview on the different types of directives. It really helped demystify some of the acronyms that we see in terms when the area is discussed. So at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. Again, if you're listening through your computer, you can submit questions through the widget on the right-hand side of the screen, or you can email any questions to mildred.paulo@klingenstein.com. Ellen McKay is going to help us field the questions gathered. So I'll turn it over to her.
Great, thanks, Maury. Thanks, Dr. Lax. That was really informative and fascinating. I learned a lot. So we do have a number of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Any that we don't get to, we'll definitely follow up with folks personally after the webinar. One of the questions that came in, or a couple people asked it, is what is the difference between a living will and a durable power of attorney for healthcare? So people have been doing their homework, clearly. So that's a question.
So they are rather, well, I'm going to be careful here. I'm a lawyer, not a doctor, but they are rather synonymous is the answer. They are rather synonymous. Durable, like a durable power of attorney with regard to financial decisions means that, once it's in force, it remains in force. But in general, a healthcare proxy remains in force, as long as you cannot make decisions. And when, should you regain the ability to make decisions, it is no longer in force. So for the way I view them as identical.
Great, thanks.
Someone slept at a Holiday Inn Express. That was a good question.
Thank you. Another great question. You sort of alluded to it, but at what age should one think about an advanced directive? And sort of what's the minimum? How often should it be revisited?
The answer is as quickly as at 18. I mean, there have been there are some terrible stories in the New York Times last year about college-age children on vacation who had life-threatening illnesses through accidents of hiking or boating, and in other countries and other jurisdictions. And you never think to have your college-age child fill out an advanced directive. I saw this article and did it for my kids. I mean, shame on me, shoemaker without his shoes. It's important that your young adult children, name you or a sibling or someone else they trust as their healthcare proxy. It should be done ASAP. I mean, if COVID has taught us anything, it has taught us that. I tell patients to revisit this at least every 10 years or when there's a significant change in health status. And I'll do it pretty regularly every 10 years or so. Again, now between the ages of 40 and 60, there may be very few changes in healthcare status. And then it's typically done when there's a change in an estate or a change in a family, a divorce, which typically results in the change of a financial will, right? And again, those documents appear at the end of a lawyer session when you have writer's cramp, and you're effectively, you're effectively filling out these documents, and it's a coda. You're just dying to get out of there and have lunch or dinner, right? Because you've been dealing with an emotionally charged subject like money, but it's worth paying attention to. I would also urge you, by the way, to file those documents, not your financial will, but your healthcare proxy and any other related documents with your primary care provider. Really good thing to do.
Thanks. Great answer. Another great couple of questions, sort of related. In this current environment with COVID and sort of the unknown, idiopathy and things that have happened and symptoms and treatments. How have directives held up? And sort of related to that was another question. How legally binding are healthcare directives? Do doctors have to follow them if they think they're wrong, for instance?
They do. They do. They are legally binding, and there have been situations in which listen to this. There have been situations in which there has been a executed healthcare proxy indicating, for example, no resuscitation, no interventions, no heroic measures, where physicians have been prosecuted for bodily invasion for violating a healthcare directive. They are binding. They are binding if they're done correctly, and as they should be. Where we get into difficulty is when adult children or Proxy 1 and Proxy 2 disagree. More often than not, I see children actually violating advanced directives. I guess we should, get out all the dirty laundry here. I've had many situations where a parent has had a very ironclad, very clear indication that they They don't want to be on mechanical ventilation or have heroic measures at the end of life. They lose capacity. It's all laid out, and the child who's been designated the healthcare proxy begins doing these things. And they'll say to me things like, well, if I could only have my dad another week or two, that would be important to me. And I get rather upset. I say, I hear you, but this is really not about what you want. It is really about what your dad wanted, and he articulated those things to me. Okay, so when at various points, sometimes the needs of adult children exceed that of a parent. It's all the more reason to get everybody into room and have this conversation to make sure everybody's on the same page. I've also seen ugly situations in which patients wanted to be kept alive with all kinds of resources and expense, and this is rather ugly, but I've seen it. A child who sees their inheritance dwindling then begins to, fire home attendants and people that are improving the quality of life for a person with frailty who wants to remain alive. I work in the field of elder abuse. We call that preservation of inheritance. It's a form of elder abuse. So it really can go in either direction. Again, all the more reason to lay these things out, designate a proxy, but don't surprise anybody. Have these discussions with all your children, all the proxies, whoever's going to be in that role. People will often ask me to be their proxy. That is verboten in just about all states that I'm aware of. It is a conflict of interest for me to be both a treating physician and to be, a healthcare proxy for reasons I think you can understand. I am, however, the healthcare proxy for many family members. My in-laws, for example. I mean, I'm the only physician in the immediate family, so and they seem to think I have some expertise in this area. So I'm, happy and honored to do that. Although I must say it causes me a good deal of anxiety as I think about it.
Great. Well, thank you. Great answer. Time for probably a couple more questions. Here's a couple different versions, and one I've been actually wondering about. How do you make sure that your wishes accompany you wherever you go? If you're out of state, if you're traveling, should you carry a wallet card that names your proxy or something like that? How do you ensure that your wishes are followed?
I love this idea. So I tell people, listen, I talked about this when I spoke to you guys in 2018. There are a bunch of things you can have with you. A list of your medications in both generic and brand name, so that people know when you're in an emergency room. I tell people to carry a copy of a recent EKG for reasons we don't need to go into now, and can be shrunk to index card size. Yes, you should carry your healthcare proxy and living will with you in some way, shape, or form. If you get it into an electronic medical record, as electronic medical records evolve, it can usually be viewed through in Epic, for example, which is one of the major sort of emerging as the kind of major outpatient EMR, has something called Care Everywhere. So I can see this or access it quickly just about any place. But it's perfectly reasonable to do this. The raison d'etre for the most is exactly what you're describing. It's a document that's meant to travel with you from place to place. It is, the way the federalist system works is that it's a state document, but it is recognized in all 50 states, and in a crunch would be honored in another state if you went to, Casper on a vacation and, developed altitude sickness and found yourself in an ICU. It would be honored, and it would be evidence of it happens to me all the time. People get off a plane at JFK with pneumonia, wind up in my emergency room. If they came from, Indianapolis, that proxy generally is honored as evidence that this is the proxy, this is what the person wants, as opposed to nothing, in which case people are throwing their hands up.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This is an interesting one, and I don't know if this is something you've addressed, but obviously there's a financial aspect to healthcare directives, prolonging healthcare, et cetera. What's your sort of guidance or thoughts on synthesizing the two aspects? The healthcare part, obviously, you have wishes in terms of how long you want to be cared for, versus financial aspects.
What a great question to ending with. I take the question to mean, how should you be spending your money? you know, at the end of your life? Should it be with, and you know, and what are the ramifications for the people who will survive you, a spouse, children for whom that might be inheritance? I think that's right. Is that the general tenor of the question? I think I got it right.
Yeah.
And I would say that, you know, my division is called Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine. I do a fair amount of palliative medicine, and maybe you'll invite me back for a subsequent talk about palliative care, which is not synonymous with hospice. Hospice is a subset of palliative medicine, but the idea that when we transition from curative care to palliative care, which is, by the way, what all internists do, we cure very few things. I don't cure hypertension. I don't cure diabetes. I don't cure arthritis. I help people have maximum quality of life in the faces of those diseases. You know, so it irks me when people say, well, you're going to stop caring for me when you move into a palliative care approach and stop spending money on heroic invasive therapies. I view that as something completely different. I view that as, no, I'm not going to stop caring for you. I'm going to care for you in a different way. I'm going to care for you in a way in which I don't care about your cholesterol anymore. I care about whether or not you enjoy the food you're eating. I don't want to spend money on an expensive hospitalization. I want to bring those resources, those aids into your home so you can be at home in comfort with your music and your photographs and your children in a comfortable way, whatever it means to you. So I think that, and as you all know, an extraordinary amount of healthcare dollars in the US are spent on really futile care in the last 6 months of life, and which often causes great harm. It's not only is it not curative and not helping people, it often causes great pain and anguish, not only for the patient who would rather be home than in an ICU, but it causes great anguish for family members who have to watch this, you know. So, you know, and in some way medicine is responsible. I talked earlier about overpromising. I think COVID has changed this. I think COVID has exposed, you know, on the one hand, it's shown amazing science. I mean, look at these vaccines that are incredibly effective. That if you ever told me a vaccine would be available with such effectiveness in 10 months from the beginning of a pandemic, I would have said you're out of your mind. It's also laid bare our limitations. You know, that, you know, even if we had ventilators for everyone, I ventilated a lot of people who did not survive, you know. And I think people are beginning to see both the promise of science, but the limitations of science. And they're beginning to, COVID has sort of really put these conversations in the fore. It's created all kinds of existential, you know, sort of reflection. I have people now retiring who were planning on retiring 10 years ago. I have people getting divorced who I never thought would get divorced. People are really thinking about the time they have left, if it's 1 year or 30 years, and how they want to spend them. And on this beautiful spring day, with great hope in the air, although I'm anxious always, I think it offers great hope and great sort of opportunities to have conversations that heretofore have been avoided and difficult to have. So these are just awesome questions, and what a sophisticated audience, but I'm used to that from you guys. And thanks for the great turnout, by the way.
Thank you so much. This was really excellent. Before we close, these are great questions. I'd just like to introduce Dana Boss, Client Services Director at Compass Care, and she's just going to say a few words about considerations and how you can get help when developing your healthcare plan.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Dana. Thank you for attending, and Mark, great presentation. Compass Care was co-founded by Dr. Lax in 2014, and we are a private duty home care company and the first company to provide residents of Fairfield County, Westchester County, and Manhattan with high quality concierge level service. The company was founded to help older adults plan for their future, and our goal is to go above and beyond to serve our clients with whatever they need and at every stage of the aging process. At Compass Care, our goal is to provide every client personal, hospitable, and professional care, and we prioritize our clients' choices about how they want to live their lives to the fullest. And then we provide the necessary planning, knowledge, and support to help them achieve their goals. Our purpose in Everything we do at Compass Care is to impact people's lives by making a difference for them every day. We understand that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to caregiving as we age, and it's our goal to work with families to create effective solutions. So Compass Care, now we are pleased to offer attendees of this webinar the gift of a complimentary home assessment in New York and Westchester and Lower Fairfield County. As it says on the slide here, part of that complimentary assessment will be an advanced directives review by a geriatric care manager, a baseline clinical assessment by one of our registered nurses, a home safety assessment, and then we'll provide you with a basic care plan recommendation. And it's our honor to do that. And if anyone wants to schedule that, my number is here, and I believe an email will be sent with this information following this webinar. And thank everyone for attending. Thank you.
All right, just to close things out, I want to give a big thank you to Mark and Dana. We hope you found this presentation helpful. This is definitely a topic that has become increasingly important for all of us. At Cliggenstein Fields Advisors, we hope that you consider us as a resource for you and your loved ones throughout your life. We welcome the opportunity to discuss our thinking and approach and encourage you to reach out to advisors with any questions on developing a plan. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. Stay well, and we look forward to speaking with you again very soon.